What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses sits down for what should be a routine morning interview, only to have the entire conversation derail into one of the most uncomfortable moments in live television history? The tension between Demi Moore and Michael Strahan on the Today Show reached a boiling point that left viewers absolutely stunned, and what started as a simple promotional appearance turned into something nobody saw coming. Before we get into exactly what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, telling me if you think Demi was out of line or completely justified in her response. Now let's dive into this. The interview started off seemingly normal. Michael Strahan welcomed Demi onto the show with his trademark smile. The audience applauded, and Demi settled into her seat with the poise you'd expect from someone who's been doing this for decades. The first few minutes covered the usual territory: her latest project, her career longevity, the kind of surface-level questions that morning shows thrive on. But then something shifted. Michael leaned forward slightly and said, "You know, Demi, I think what a lot of people find fascinating about you is how you've managed to stay relevant in an industry that's notoriously tough on women as they age. How do you do it?" There was a pause. Not a long one, but long enough that you could feel something change in the air. Demi's expression, which had been warm and open, seemed to harden just a fraction. "Stay relevant," she repeated, her voice calm but with an edge that wasn't there before. "That's an interesting choice of words, Michael." Michael seemed to sense he'd stepped into something but pressed forward. "Well, you know what I mean. Hollywood has a reputation for being ageist, especially toward women. You've defied that." "I have defied that," Demi agreed. "But the implication in your question is that my relevance is somehow surprising or noteworthy, simply because I'm a woman over 50. Would you ask a male actor how he stays relevant at my age?" The audience went quiet. Michael shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting this turn. "I think that's a fair point, but I was trying to acknowledge the double standard that exists." "By perpetuating it?" Demi's voice remained even, but there was no mistaking the challenge in her words. "Michael, I've been in this industry for over 4 decades. I've heard every version of that question. The thing is, when you frame it that way, you're suggesting that my career is an anomaly, that I'm somehow lucky to still be working, rather than acknowledging that I'm working because I'm good at what I do." Michael tried to recover. "That's absolutely not what I meant. I have tremendous respect for your work." "Do you?" Demi tilted her head slightly. "Because it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're more interested in discussing my age than my talent." "I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the realities of Hollywood," Michael said, his voice taking on a slightly defensive tone. "Then let's have an honest conversation," Demi replied. "Let's talk about why morning shows like this one constantly ask women about aging, about how they maintain their appearance, about how they balance family and career, while men get asked about their craft, their process, their vision. Let's talk about that reality." You could see Michael trying to regain control of the interview. "Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about your craft then. Your new film deals with some pretty heavy themes." "It does," Demi said, but her body language made it clear she wasn't ready to let the previous exchange go completely. "But I'm curious, Michael. Did you prepare these questions yourself, or did a producer hand them to you on a card?" That question landed like a bomb. The camera caught Michael's face, and you could see him processing whether to be honest or deflect. "We have a team that helps prepare segments, as you know. That's standard for any show like this." "I do know," Demi said. "I've done hundreds of these, and what I've noticed is that the questions I get are rarely about the depth of my work. They're about my age, my relationships, my appearance. Meanwhile, when my male co-stars come on shows like this, they're asked about their method, their preparation, their artistic choices." Michael spread his hands. "Demi, I hear what you're saying, but I think you might be reading into this more than what's actually there." "Am I?" Demi's voice was sharp now. "Let me ask you something. Did you watch the film we're supposed to be discussing?" There was another pause, this one more uncomfortable than the first. Michael's smile faltered. "I've seen clips and read extensive notes about it." "So that's a no," Demi said, and now there was no hiding her frustration. "You haven't watched the film. But you're sitting here interviewing me about it, asking me questions about aging and relevance instead of engaging with the actual work. That's not entirely fair, Michael protested. I have a demanding schedule, and we interview dozens of guests every week. And I have a demanding schedule too, Demi countered. But I showed up here prepared to discuss my work with someone I assumed would have enough professional courtesy to actually watch it. This is exactly the problem, Michael. The lack of effort, the superficial questions, the assumption that it's enough to just ask a woman about her age and call it an interview. It's lazy and, frankly, it's disrespectful. The tension in the studio was palpable now. The camera kept cutting between Demi's stern expression and Michael's increasingly uncomfortable demeanor. This wasn't playful banter or a light-hearted disagreement. This was a genuine confrontation playing out in real time. Michael tried to compose himself, clearly aware that this interview had gone completely off the rails. He glanced toward someone off camera, possibly a producer, before turning back to Demi with what looked like a forced attempt at diplomacy. "Look, I apologize if you feel disrespected," he said carefully. "That genuinely wasn't my intention." "If I feel disrespected?" Demi leaned forward slightly. "Michael, this isn't about my feelings. This is about a pattern of behavior that happens across this entire industry. You're not the villain here, but you are participating in a system that consistently undervalues women's work while overemphasizing their age and appearance." "I understand that," Michael said, "and I think it's an important conversation to have. But maybe this isn't the right forum for it." "Why not?" Demi's question was direct. "You have millions of people watching right now. When is the right time to have this conversation if not when we're actually in the middle of experiencing it? This is the perfect forum." Michael looked genuinely stuck. You could see him weighing his options, trying to figure out how to navigate this situation without making it worse. "Okay, you're right. Let's have this conversation. What would you like me to ask you?" "I'd like you to ask me about the character I play in this film," Demi said, her voice still firm but slightly less combative. "I'd like you to ask me about the 3 months I spent preparing for this role, about the research I did, about the emotional places I had to go to bring this woman to life. I'd like you to ask me something that shows you see me as an artist, not just as a celebrity who happens to still be working at my age." "Why?" There was a moment where you could see Michael genuinely considering her words. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. "All right, tell me about the character. Who is she, and what drew you to her?" Demi seemed to relax slightly, though the tension hadn't completely left her shoulders. She's a woman who has spent her entire life making herself smaller to fit into spaces that were never designed for her. She's exhausted herself trying to be palatable, trying to be what everyone else needs her to be. And the film is about what happens when she finally decides to stop. It's about reclaiming your voice after decades of silence. "That sounds powerful," Michael said, and for the first time in the interview, it sounded genuine rather than performative. "Is that something you relate to personally?" "Of course I do," Demi replied. "Every woman I know relates to it on some level. We're taught from a very young age to be accommodating, to not make waves, to smile and be pleasant even when we're being dismissed or disrespected. This character finally reaches a breaking point, and there's something incredibly cathartic about playing that." Michael nodded slowly. "I can imagine that resonated with you, especially given what we've just experienced here." "It did," Demi said. "And I'll be honest with you, Michael, I didn't come here planning to have this confrontation. But when you opened with that question about staying relevant, something in me just snapped. I'm tired of pretending these questions are acceptable. I'm tired of watching talented women get reduced to their age while men get celebrated for their longevity." "I hear you," Michael said. "And I think a lot of people watching right now are hearing you too. But I have to ask, and I'm asking this genuinely, do you think I would have gotten this kind of response if I'd asked the same question differently?" Demi considered this for a moment. "Maybe, maybe not. The specific wording matters, but so does the context. When that's the first substantial question you ask, when you haven't even watched the film we're supposed to be discussing, it sends a message about what you think is important. And what you thought was important wasn't my work. It was my age. That's fair, Michael conceded. I should have watched the film. You're right about that. Thank you for acknowledging that, Demi said, and some of the tension finally seemed to ease. Look, I know you're not a bad person, Michael. I know you're doing a job, and that job comes with certain expectations and time constraints. But at some point, we all have to be accountable for the impact of our words and actions, regardless of our intentions. Michael was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was more thoughtful. You know, I think one of the things that makes this so complicated is that I genuinely thought I was giving you a compliment. I thought acknowledging that you've defied ageism was a positive thing. I understand that, Demi replied, but that's exactly the problem. The bar is so low for women that simply continuing to work past a certain age is considered an achievement worthy of praise. That's not a compliment, Michael. That's a reflection of how broken the system is. So what's the solution? Michael asked. How do we do better? You start by doing your homework, Demi said simply. You watch the film. You prepare questions that engage with the actual work. You treat women artists with the same level of seriousness and intellectual curiosity that you bring to interviews with men. It's not complicated, it just requires effort and intentionality. And if I'm being honest, she continued, it also requires being willing to sit in uncomfortable conversations like this one. Because change doesn't happen when everyone's comfortable. It happens when someone finally says, enough is enough. Michael nodded, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was genuinely processing what she was saying. I appreciate you being willing to have this conversation on air. I know it would have been easier for you to just smile and get through the interview. Easier for whom? Demi asked pointedly. Easier for you, certainly. Easier for your producers who now have to figure out how to handle this situation. But it wouldn't have been easier for me, Michael. It would have been more of the same exhausting performance I've been giving my entire career, and I'm done with that. The camera stayed on both of them, and you could feel the weight of everything that had just been said hanging in the air between them. Michael shifted forward in his seat, and for a moment it looked like he might try to move on to a different topic, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the rawness of what Demi had just said, or maybe it was the realization that trying to pivot now would only prove her point further. Can I push back on something? He asked, his tone careful but not defensive. Please do, Demi said, gesturing for him to continue. You said you're done performing, done playing the game. But isn't that a privilege in itself? A lot of people, women especially, don't have the option to stop performing. They need the work. They need to stay in good standing with the media. You can afford to have this confrontation because you're Demi Moore. What about the actresses who can't? Demi didn't hesitate. You're absolutely right. I have privilege, and I'm using it. That's exactly what it's for. I can have this conversation precisely because I've reached a point in my career where I don't need to worry about being blacklisted for speaking up. But that doesn't make the conversation less important, Michael. If anything, it makes it more important. Because I have a responsibility to use my platform to say the things that other women can't say without risking their livelihoods. That's a fair point, Michael acknowledged. But doesn't that put me in an impossible position? If I ask you softball questions, I'm being superficial. If I ask you challenging questions, I'm being disrespectful. Where's the middle ground? The middle ground is competence, Demi said firmly. Watch the film. Prepare thoughtful questions about the work itself. Ask me about my process, about the choices I made, about what I hope audiences take away from the film. Those aren't softball questions, Michael. Those are the questions that should be standard for any serious interview about creative work. But we also have an audience to consider, Michael countered. And the reality is, people are interested in your personal life, your age, how you maintain your career. That's what gets engagement. So you're admitting that you cater to the lowest common denominator. Demi's eyebrow arched. Michael paused, clearly realizing how that sounded. I'm saying we have to balance substance with what audiences respond to. And I'm saying that audiences respond to what you give them, Demi replied. If you constantly feed them superficial content, they'll consume superficial content. But if you give them something meaningful, something that makes them think, they'll respond to that too. You're underestimating your own audience. Maybe, Michael said, and there was a weariness in his voice now. But I also know that when we have these kinds of conversations, when things get contentious like this, people tune in. This interview is probably going to get more views than anything else we air this month. Is that what you think this is? Demi's voice hardened again. A ratings ploy. You think I'm sitting here calling out systemic sexism for attention? No, that's not what I meant, Michael said quickly. I'm just acknowledging the reality of how media works. Conflict drives engagement. Which is exactly why nothing changes, Demi said, her frustration evident. Because even when women speak up about legitimate issues, it gets packaged as entertainment. It gets turned into content. People will watch they'll comment on who won the argument, who looked better, who was more articulate, and the actual substance of what we're discussing will get lost in the spectacle of it all. Michael was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was more subdued. So what do you want to happen here? What's the outcome you're looking for? I want you to care, Demi said simply. I want you to care enough to watch the films of the people you interview. I want you to care enough to prepare questions that reflect an actual engagement with their work. I want you to care enough to think about the impact of your words, not just your intentions. Is that really too much to ask? No, Michael admitted. It's not too much to ask. Then why does it feel like such a radical request? Demi pressed. Why does asking for basic professional respect turn into this big confrontation? Why is the bar so low that simply asking someone to do their job properly becomes controversial? Michael rubbed his face briefly, and for the first time he looked genuinely uncomfortable rather than just diplomatically navigating a difficult situation. I think because it forces people like me to confront things we'd rather not look at. It's easier to go through the motions, to rely on the standard questions, to not think too deeply about the implications of what we're saying. Your calling me out on that is uncomfortable, and people don't like being uncomfortable. I don't like being uncomfortable either, Demi said. But I'm 50+ years into being uncomfortable in this industry. I'm uncomfortable every time I read a script where women my age are written as invisible or irrelevant. I'm uncomfortable every time I sit down for an interview and brace myself for questions about my appearance or my age. I'm uncomfortable every time I watch younger actresses get asked the same reductive questions I was asked 30 years ago. So forgive me if I'm not too concerned about making you uncomfortable for 10 minutes on your show. The bluntness of her statement seemed to hit Michael hard. He nodded slowly, not trying to argue or defend himself further. That's valid. That's completely valid. I'm not trying to destroy you here, Demi said, her tone softening slightly. I'm really not. But somebody has to say these things, and it might as well be me in this moment, to you. Because if not now, when? If not here, where? These conversations have to happen, Michael, and they're never going to be comfortable. I get that, Michael said. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're having it. Even though I'm currently wishing I could be anywhere else. That got a slight smile from Demi. The first one since the interview had turned confrontational. Trust me, there are about 100 other things I'd rather be doing right now too. But this matters more than my comfort, or yours. Can I ask you something else? Michael ventured. And I'm asking this because I genuinely want to understand, not because I'm trying to catch you in anything. Go ahead, Demi said. Do you think there's any scenario where this interview could have gone differently? Or was this confrontation inevitable the moment I asked that first question? Demi considered this carefully. I think if you'd watched the film, if you'd prepared questions that showed you respected my work, if you'd approached this interview with the same level of preparation you'd bring to interviewing a male actor of my stature, then yes, this could have gone very differently. But given the circumstances, given the question you opened with and the admission that you hadn't actually watched the film, I think some version of this conversation was probably inevitable. Because I'm at a point in my life where I'm just not willing to let these things slide anymore. Michael nodded, absorbing her words. There was a long pause, and you could sense the entire studio holding its breath, waiting to see where this would go next. Finally, Michael spoke again. I want to circle back to something you said earlier about your character in the film. You said she spends her life making herself smaller, and then she stops. What does that look like? What happens when she stops? Demi studied him for a moment as if trying to determine whether this was a genuine question or another attempt to move past the discomfort. Apparently deciding it was genuine, she leaned back slightly. She loses everything, Demi said. At least that's what it looks like at first. She loses relationships. She loses opportunities. She loses the version of herself that everyone was comfortable with. But what she gains is something more valuable. She gains herself back. She gains the ability to look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back at her. That sounds like it comes from a personal place, Michael observed. Everything I do comes from a personal place, Demi replied. You can't give an authentic performance without drawing on your own experiences, your own pain, your own truth. This character resonated with me because I've lived versions of her story. I've spent years contorting myself to fit into spaces that weren't designed for me, smiling through interviews that dismissed my work, accepting roles that were beneath my talent because I was told I should be grateful for any opportunity. And at a certain point, you either continue down that path until you disappear completely, or you decide to stand up and say no more. Is that what today is? Michael asked quietly. You saying no more? Yes, Demi said without hesitation. This is me saying no more. No more softball questions that avoid the real work. No more accepting interviews where the host hasn't bothered to engage with what I've actually created. No more pretending that it's okay to be treated as a curiosity rather than as a serious artist. I'm done with all of it. Michael was quiet, and when he finally spoke, his voice was measured. You know this is going to follow both of us for a while. People are going to have a lot of opinions about what happened here today. Let them, Demi said. I'd rather be criticized for speaking my truth than praised for staying silent. And honestly, Michael, you have an opportunity here too. You can either get defensive and dismiss what I've said, or you can actually hear it and use it to do better. That choice is yours. What if I told you I want to do better, but I don't know how to do that within the constraints of this format? Michael asked. We have limited time. We have commercial breaks. We have producers in our ears telling us what topics to hit. How do I balance all of that with the kind of depth you're asking for? You make it a priority, Demi said simply. You tell your producers that you're not going to interview people whose work you haven't engaged with. You push back when you're handed questions that reduce your guests to stereotypes or tabloid fodder. You use your position and your influence to demand better, not just for yourself, but for the people you're interviewing. It's not easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. And if I do that, if I try to change the way we do things here, I risk losing my job, Michael said, and there was something vulnerable in his admission. Maybe, Demi acknowledged, but you might also set a new standard. You might inspire other hosts to do the same. You might actually use your platform for something meaningful instead of just maintaining the status quo. Isn't that worth the risk? Michael didn't answer immediately. The camera stayed on his face, capturing the conflict playing out in his expression. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a murmur. I don't know. That's honest, Demi said, and for the first time since the confrontation began, there was something almost gentle in her tone. I appreciate that honesty, but I hope you'll think about what I've said. I hope you'll think about whether the comfort of keeping your job exactly as it is right now is worth the cost of perpetuating a system that harms people. That's heavy, Michael said, trying for a lightness that didn't quite land. It is heavy, Demi agreed. But that doesn't make it less true. There was another pause, and then Michael seemed to make a decision. Okay, let's do this properly. I'm going to watch your film tonight, and I want to have you back on the show to have a real conversation about it. A conversation where I've actually done my homework and can engage with your work the way it deserves. Would you be willing to do that? Demi looked genuinely surprised. Are you serious? Completely serious, Michael said. I'm not going to sit here and pretend this interview went the way anyone planned. It didn't. But maybe that's okay. Maybe this needed to happen. And maybe the best thing I can do now is to actually follow through and show you that I heard what you said. And your producers are going to be okay with that? Demi asked skeptically. I have no idea, Michael admitted. But like you said, I have influence here. I can use it. And if they say no, then that tells me something important about whether this is the right place for me. Demi studied him carefully, and you could see her weighing whether to believe him. All right, if you're genuinely committed to doing this properly, then yes, I'll come back. But Michael, I'm going to hold you to this. If you invite me back and you still haven't watched the film, if you show up with the same superficial questions, I'm going to call you out on it again. And it won't be pretty. I wouldn't expect anything less, Michael said, and this time his smile seemed genuine rather than performative. I'm going to do better. I promise you that. Don't promise me, Demi said firmly. Promise yourself. Promise your audience. And then follow through. Michael nodded, and there was a weight to the moment that felt significant. Deal. The interview wrapped shortly after that, with Michael thanking Demi for her time and for her honesty, even though it had been uncomfortable. Demi graciously accepted, standing to shake his hand before leaving the set. But the energy in the studio had fundamentally changed. What had started as a standard promotional interview had turned into something far more meaningful and far more challenging. This wasn't just another celebrity appearance. This was a moment where someone refused to play the game, refused to make it easy, refused to let harmful patterns continue unchecked. Whether Michael would actually follow through on his promise remained to be seen, but at the very least, he'd been forced to confront the reality of how these interviews often operate and the toll they take on the people being interviewed. Demi Moore had come to the Today Show to promote a film, but she'd ended up doing something far more important. She'd started a conversation that the industry desperately needs to have, and she'd done it in a way that was impossible to ignore or dismiss. And regardless of how people feel about the confrontation itself, one thing is certain. Nobody who watched that interview will forget it anytime soon. So what do you think? Was Demi Moore right to confront Michael Strahan the way she did? Or did she take it too far? Do you believe Michael will actually follow through and have her back for a proper interview? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more breakdowns of the moments that have everyone talking.